Well, we're now ready to begin the stub material, this final part of the Level 1 ethics. So you can rejoice, another 2 or 3 hours and we'll be done with this. No, I'm just kidding. It'll only take us 20 minutes or so to get through this, the part on GIPS here. So what we're about to do is, of course, the finish up part of Level 1 ethics. We've gone through the preamble stuff. We went through the code. We did the standards of professional conduct, which is the main event. You'll see a bunch of that stuff is echoed in the GIPS material that we're going to review now. To place this in perspective, remember that when we were talking about communicating with clients and prospective clients, we said that you have an ethical responsibility to give fair and complete information. So fair, accurate, and complete information. Well, if you have fair, accurate, and complete information, then you are in compliance with the ethical standards. You are not obligated to comply with GIPS. GIPS is a tool that you can use to meet your obligation to be fair, accurate, and complete, but you are not obligated to, of course, comply with all these GIPS parameters. So this is a fairly extensive system. Of course, in our industry, there is wondrous variety, and in order to describe a reporting system or presentation system that would allow for that variety, you're going to have very extensive guidelines, and that's what you see when you really dig into GIPS. Now, we're not really going to dig into GIPS. This is truly just an introduction. We're going to go through and spend a few minutes talking about why we have GIPS, who is impacted by GIPS, what the purposes of GIPS were. We'll talk about the key factors, and then a little bit about what it would look like to actually go in and study GIPS when we talk about the parts in the GIPS standards right at the end of this presentation. So there's lots of material here. I think that this has been something that I'm personally a fan of. We work in an industry where it is easy to obfuscate what you're really doing. The purpose here is to provide a uniform standard, a global standard, so that we can promote fair competition, and you will see that as we proceed through the material. So let's start out with the why of GIPS. So why were GIPS created? Well, GIPS makes performance measurement among firms comparable. So everyone's reporting on the same basis with standardized calculation and reporting practices and those types of things. So again, if you go back to my idea that you're thinking of a money manager dealing with an unsophisticated client. So this is a client that just won a $100 million lottery. He's got a bunch of people, or she's got a bunch of people vying to manage some of her newfound wealth. Well, the problem is that the information presented by all the suitors would be compiled under slightly different standards or in slightly different formats, and that would make it hard for this unsophisticated investor to wade through all of the ins and outs of the calculation methodologies and the composite statements and the disclosures and be able to decide who was really the best for his or her needs. The point of having a GIPS compliant presentation, or if all of the people vying for the business were compliant with GIPS, we would have much more standardized presentations, and it would be much easier for the typical investor to be able to determine who in fact has the best performance and who has the best prospects of having good performance in the future. So the aim here is to avoid misrepresentation when we are talking about the performance of an investment firm, and to give the clients the relevant information to evaluate past performance. So if this is what we've created GIPS to do, who is impacted by that? So who is impacted by GIPS? Well, two parties primarily. One of those is going to be the firms. So the firms, this is the firms that are actually making the performance presentation. So they're saying, look, we've managed money in the past. Here have been the results. Well, the firm that is GIPS compliant will be the one that complies with the material that we're going over now. The real reason behind this, of course, is to be able to deal fairly with clients and prospective clients so that they can have the information that they need to make good decisions. So it is impacting the firm, and it is also impacting the client when we talk about who is impacted by GIPS. Those are the main two parties. Now, there are lots of observers on the sideline. There's the regulators, there's the institute, and as we're going to talk about in a little while, there are verifiers or third-party verifiers. So there are other parties to this arrangement, but these are the two intended parties in terms of the whys about the presentation under GIPS. All right, so what about composites? Now, we talked a little bit about composites earlier when we were going through the code and standards, and we even used the word composites. Well, remember, a composite is a grouping of individual discretionary portfolios that are all managed the same strategy objective, or as I'm going to refer to it, the same mandate. And the point here is that it would be possible for a money manager who has a group of portfolios managed to a similar mandate. So let's call it, and we'll use something very, very broad, but let's just say that we have a portfolio manager who runs money under a value fund for a lot of different pension funds. So they've got a pension fund A, B, C, and D. They've got a chunk of money from each of those pension funds, and they're supposed to be managing relative to some, we'll call it an amorphous value mandate here. Probably be something more specific than that, but nonetheless, and so it's an equity fund focused on value investing. Well, the trouble is that the money manager is going to have different performance in each of those accounts. And what we want to avoid is having that money manager grab the account that's had the best performance over the last 5 years and then hold that up to the investing public as being representative of their performance. What we want them to do is we want them to form a composite. So if they have 5 different portfolios, we want them to add them to all together on an asset-weighted basis, of course, okay, and then report the entire group rather than an individual fund. Remember that when we're doing this, we're going to include current and past customers. So when we report 5 years of historical data, well, for three of those, so 2 years ago we had a customer leave us to go somewhere else. So in our 5-year history, there's 3 years that would still include the accounts from this departed client. Okay, well, we need to make sure that we include the accounts of those clients who have left, because as we said earlier, no one's ever called their money manager and said, well, you're making me too much money, so I'm leaving. Of course, the clients that leave are the ones that have too much volatility or the ones that they feel like they're underperforming. So if you omit clients that are no longer in the stable, that is clients that are no longer employing the services of the money manager, you're biasing the average up and you're biasing in all likelihood the volatility downward. So we have to include in our composites those customers who are currently using our service, and as we report historical data, any customers who were using our services during the time periods reported. Okay, so it's both current and past that are going to be included in a particular composite. And what we also don't want to have happen is we don't want to get into the end of the year. We're about to calculate our results for reporting purposes. We call on somebody who's a good linear programmer, say, here's all the ways we could group portfolios. You run a linear program and tell us what's going to look best. No, what we want to do is we want the groupings to be pre-identified. So we're going to identify those groupings ex ante, and then ex post we'll put the portfolios into the composite, we'll calculate the returns, and we will have hopefully better data because of it. All right, so those are the composites, and if we really wanted to dig in and study GIPS, we would see that composite construction is in fact a key element of this global investment performance standards. Now, what about verification? Okay, verification. The thing to remember here is that this is voluntary. So voluntarily, a firm can hire an independent third party to verify their claim of GIPS compliance. So what we're going to see in a few slides is that there is a GIPS compliance statement. So firms that meet the standards, and we'll talk about what those are as we go through here, but firms that meet the standard can actually put on their presentation, this presentation is compiled in accordance with GIPS, and I'll show you the exact language of that in just a moment. Okay, well, but beyond that, beyond just saying, okay, we are compliant, if you want to add some external validation to that, that is to provide assurance to the investing public that you are actually compliant, then you can go out and you can hire a third party or an independent verifier. And this has been, I think, a growth industry over the last 10 or 15 years. We've seen, I think, at least a couple of the big four accounting firms have offices that will go in and do GIPS verification. There are some firms that have grown up around this process, and so there's been some nice businesses created there because of the need for third-party validation of GIPS compliance. Of course, when I am emperor, which we're all hoping for, but when I'm emperor, all firms are going to have to be GIPS compliant, and we're going to have this verification. It's an external audit. It is bringing in a third party that is going to attest to the fact that we are in fact complying as we say we are in the compliance statement. Now, what are the requirements for compliance? Well, first of all, if we're looking at verification here, then it has to be performed by a third party. And this idea of firm-wide basis is going to be something you're going to see a couple of times as we finish this material out. So you can't comply with GIPS in a composite or in a particular asset class or something else. If you're going to claim GIPS compliance, then you have to do it on a firm-wide basis. And what exactly a firm is, we'll have a little bit more data on in just a little while. The verifier, again, here, remember, we're still talking about verification. The verifier must attest that the firm has complied with GIPS requirements for composite construction, that's one, for the firm's processes and procedures, for presentation, and also calculation method, the way they collect the data, and the format they use. So it's a fairly extensive process to go through and verify this GIPS compliance. So and things like calculation method, if you're not familiar with the difference between arithmetic and geometric means, for instance, that's the first thing we'll do when we get to study session 3. There's not a right way and a wrong way, but there are different ways to compute averages and those types of things. So what we want to be able to standardize that, and that's what GIPS does. It has a certain, specified calculation methodologies, specified data requirements and format requirements that are in fact quite extensive. Now, what about the objectives of GIPS? So the objectives here are to obtain or to create a global acceptance of calculation and presentation standards. We want a fair and comparable format that has full disclosure. Again, if we think of my scenario where you have a money manager working with an unsophisticated client, well, you're reporting your results that are GIPS compliant. Anyone else that's going to try to take that business will also use a GIPS compliant presentation if we actually had this as a globally accepted standard. Well, that's going to make the information flows much better for the client. So if you're really good, you're going to want to have GIPS. If you're not sure you're good, then maybe you want to obfuscate the truth by some sort of calculation methodology and composite construction games. Well, then you don't want the world moving to GIPS. Now, you, of course, are obligated to have fair, accurate, and complete information. So remember, you are obligated under the code and standards to have fair, accurate, and complete information. GIPS is a tool that you can use to meet that requirement. So while I told jokes about you not being good and trying to obfuscate the truth, you still can't do that because you have this obligation to live up to the code and standards, and the standards very clearly say full, accurate, and complete information. So ensure consistent, accurate performance data, and that's for reporting purposes, marketing purposes, presentations that you make. And we want to promote fair competition. This is the big deal. And of course, we want to promote industry self-regulation. Of course, in recent years in the United States, we've seen a failure, perhaps, of self-regulation. And if self-regulation fails, what happens? Well, then you get external regulation or government regulation. And in the United States, we've seen that happen, and that's, of course, a sad outcome. So that's the objectives of GIPS. Let's talk about key characteristics. So the key characteristics of GIPS here, to claim compliance, we have to define what the firm is. And the firm is a distinct business entity. You can think of this as the business that is held out to the public. So if you look at the big players in the financial industry, well, there's so much cross-breeding and ownership and those types of things. But in the end, you have to decide what is the business entity that is held out to the public. That is the firm, and compliance has to be done on a firm-wide basis. Of course, we're dealing with ethical standards for performance presentation, and we're trying to ensure fair representation of our results. And we're going to include all actual fee-paying discretionary portfolios in a composite for a 5-year minimum, or since inception. So if we're only a 3-year-old shop, Well, we can still claim GIPS compliance if our portfolios are reported since inception, okay? But if we are 5 years or since inception, each year we have to add one more year until we get up to 10. So what we really want is we want a presentation of 10 years of GIPS compliant performance. That would be the ultimate goal for presentation purposes. Now, continuing on with our key characteristics. So we have certain calculation presentation standards that are going to be required. We're not going to talk about what they are here at level 1, but again, how do you calculate an average? How do you construct a composite? What type of data are you going to present? All of those types of things are going to have to be specified as calculation and presentation standards that are going to be required. Also, and very importantly, if you go through the data, you're going to have some input requirements. So the input data has to be accurate. It's a GIGO process, garbage in, garbage out. Well, if you don't have good data to put in on the front end, you're certainly not going to get good data out on the back end. Okay? Now, there's going to be two parts to studying GIPS. One of those is going to be the required elements. You can't claim compliance without complying with the required elements, obviously. And then there's also going to be some recommendations, which are certainly encouraged. Okay, but if it's a recommendation, it's just that. It's a recommendation. You don't have to comply with it. Okay, what about partial compliance? Okay, well, essentially there is no partial compliance. So you can't say this presentation is presented in compliance with GIPS except for, and then you list the exception or something like that. Okay, so you can't claim compliance on anything but a firm-wide basis, and you can't even mention GIPS unless you're claiming compliance, and you can't claim some sort of partial compliance. Now, if GIPS is in conflict with local laws, well then that's a different story. Of course, you have to comply with the local laws, but you can still be compliant and claim compliance if you disclose what that conflict is. So to the extent that local laws say you have to do something different, well, then you do it in accordance with the law. GIPS would not be a very good system if it required you to break the law. So you still do it in compliance with the local laws, but then you have to make sure that you are disclosing the difference between the local laws or the conflict between the local laws and the GIPS standard. Okay, so what about the claim of compliance? Well, here's what you're working for. Okay, so this is what I would like to see on every presentation and every report that comes out of any sort of money management firm. So the firm name, whoever that is, Andes Investments, has prepared and presented this report in compliance with the Global Investment Performance Standards. If you are on a firm-wide basis, you comply with all the elements, then you get to use that statement. That's the big Benny. Okay, there can't have any statement referring to calculation methodologies used in composites as being in accordance with GIPS. Okay, so GIPS is owned or controlled by the Institute, and you can't cherry pick out the parts you want. You're either within GIPS compliance in which you can claim it. Otherwise, you simply have to use GIPS, leave GIPS out of the process. Now, let's talk about fundamental responsibilities. So fundamental responsibilities here for a GIPS compliant firm, of course, you're supposed to provide a compliant presentation. So if you're making a pitch, you're in the finals, okay, well then you've got to, whatever material you present, it has to be compliant with GIPS. So you're going to provide a composite list and a description to all prospects who make a request. Okay, these two bullet points are very similar, but on client request, provide compliant presentation and a composite description. Again, I always wonder how many people ask for a composite description, even though it's a very important variable, unless there is some sort of problem. I'm going to call up one time and ask for a composite description just to see if anyone knows what I'm talking about. But nonetheless, okay, what about joint marketing? So you're doing everything you're supposed to do. You're GIPS compliant. You've got your compliance statement on there. You're very proud of that, but you're doing joint marketing with a non-compliant firm. Well, then what do you have to do? It is your responsibility as the GIPS compliant firm to make sure that you separate compliant and non-compliant firm data. So we've got to separate out the reports from the non-compliant firm if we're going to engage in joint marketing efforts. Okay, so firm definition and historical record. Again, and we've said this a couple of times now, but you can only claim compliance if you're doing it on a firm-wide basis, and the firm has to be a distinct business entity. That is what is held out to the investing public. Of course, you have to use all actual fee-paying discretionary portfolios, minimum 5 years or since inception. And of course, if you're using 5 years because you're just getting in the GIPS compliant world, okay, well then you have to add 1 year every year to stay in compliance until you get to this 10-year history. That's the gold standard. 10 years of GIPS compliant, 10 years of GIPS compliant performance results. That is something that you can hang your hat on if you are evaluating money managers, or at least that's the idea behind it. What about these country standards that we used to have? Now, this is really a history lesson for most of you, but we used to have the country versions of GIPS. So if there was a particular country that had some sort of presentation laws of their own, well, we had a country version for country A and a country version for country B. Okay, well, what it boils down to is that firms that previously represented their performance in compliance with a specific country version of GIPS can claim compliance prior to 1106. Now this is the date where we did away with those and we unified under a single standard. But I think that this is now, since it's getting to where 1106 is a long time ago, I think that's actually becoming something that is irrelevant in the real world, and I think increasingly perhaps irrelevant for exam purposes. Okay, in cases where country-specific regulations are different from GIPS, of course you follow the country-specific regulations and you disclose the nature of the conflict. So we've already said that, but an important part of the GIPS world. All right, we're to the very last thing now. So when you get down to where you really want to dive in and study GIPS, maybe after this 20 minutes you're going to find this so fascinating that you're going to quit your job in money management and go get a job with one of the verifiers. I kind of doubt it, but nonetheless, if that's what you're going to do, when you study GIPS, what you're going to see is that there are 9 major sections. They're numbered 0 through 8, but there's 9 major sections of GIPS. What we need to do to finish this out, get you past this ethics material, I know you're anxious for it, is simply to briefly review what each of these sections are. So we start out with section 0, that's fundamental issues in compliance. So this is fundamental things that the firm has to consider, like what is the definition of the firm. Second, we have to think about input data. And of course, this is a great big deal. How do you harvest the data? How do you store it? It's got to be consistent. It's got to be, all the data has to be there in order to make comparable performances. So there's lots of requirements associated with the collection and storage of the data. Okay, number 2, so on our list of 9, this would be number 3, but I'm just going to go by the numbering system they use, 0, 1, 2, are the calculation methodologies. Okay, I think if we were really to dig into this if the curriculum required us to dig into this at level 1, this would be an area where you would look at it and spend a lot of time, because we would have to talk about what the calculation methodologies were, and then of course the requirement for uniformity in those methods. Luckily, in our circumstances preparing for the level 1 exam, we need to know that the calculation methodologies are well specified, okay, but they are not something that we have to spend a lot of time worrying about here. Section 3 deals with composite construction. Again, the basic principle that you want to remember there is that we're going to create meaningful asset-weighted composites. Okay, essentially all of the actual fee-paying discretionary accounts have to be in a composite. They should be determined ex ante. That is, the grouping should be predetermined, and of course they should include current and previous clients. So composite construction, a big deal, and if you were a verifier, that would be something you'd spend a lot of time on. Section 4 on disclosures, there's information that has to be disclosed about the presentations, the policies, how the calculations were made, those types of things. So there is a list of disclosures that goes with any GIPS compliant presentation. Presentation and reporting, of course, we're supposed to present the investment performance according to GIPS requirements. So once we go through all this and we have all the data, we comply with all the methodologies, well then once we actually make the presentation, we need to do something about it and actually have that as part of our of the presentation that we're making. Okay, 6 and 7 here are something that you could find confusing, you could spend a lot of time on. I don't want you to get bogged down on these though. two very straightforward points. One, real estate. So if you have portfolios that have real estate in them, well, the provisions of GIPS apply to real estate investment, and it doesn't matter what level of control the firm has over the management of the investment itself. So if you've got real estate, you've got that in some sort of fund, you're going to create a composite. Even if you were, say, just doing the debt side of it. So you had a fund that was investing in mortgages. Well, you don't have a lot of control over the management of the investment. You would still have it under this the GIPS compliant stuff that we've seen so far. Number 7, private equity. This is quite an extensive section. But the notion here is that the value in private equity investments has to be reported according to GIPS private equity valuation principles, unless it's an open-end or evergreen fund. But nonetheless, the point here is that there are very specific principles. Now, this is actually going to be something you're going to get a view of, not from necessarily a GIPS point of view, but from a valuation point of view, and it just happens to be GIPS compliant as you progress through the CFA curriculum, but you're not going to see that at level 1. Just realize that this creates a very unique and challenging valuation framework, and there are special rules that are associated with the private equity investments that would be reported. And finally, if you have wrap fee or separately managed accounts, SMAs, okay, well, a supplement to sections 0 through 5 that we've talked about previously with specific reference to those provisions which don't apply to wrap fee stuff and some things that supersede. For the most part, I would identify this as being a technical thing that is going to be probably off the radar for level 1, but there are some special circumstances that occur there. And that, my friends, is the ethics material for level 1. I realize that's taken us a long time to get through and it's somewhat arduous, okay, but also at level 1, this is the exam where this ethics stuff has the biggest stake. 15% of the exam is going to be here. Remember, being a good person is going to get you very little traction on the exam. You're going to have to get into this stuff. You're going to have to know it well. My advice is that you go back and you read your Schweizer notes very carefully. You underline, you read the little vignettes they have that are intended to create understanding, and then you answer as many questions as possible so that you can develop some intuition about how to address ethics questions. So hopefully you have good intuition about ethics. Hopefully this material will enhance your ability to be an ethical practitioner. But aside from that, I think you need to have intuition about how to address ethics questions. And the way you do that is to develop to answer lots of questions. So if you've got Schweizer Pro, that's the test bank. You ought to make sure that you're going through there, answering questions. Go back, look up answers to things you don't know, read the answers to the questions you get wrong, and I think you'll see that this is something that you can do well on, but this is going to take as much effort as any of the other sections. So you have some sections you feel good about or some topic areas you feel good about, others you're a little more worried about. This will take as much effort as those that you're worried about. So if you're not a derivatives jockey, you're worried about derivatives, GIPS is going to be just as concerning and just as time consuming as derivatives for you. So this is something you have to spend time on, but in the end, you can pick up lots of points here, and it's going to help you get past this difficult level 1 exam. Good luck on this material, and I hope it helps you on the exam, and I hope it helps you become a more ethical practitioner.